Okay, so picking up where we left off, there might also be some dangers that might come along with things like physical training or challenges that you may have for some of your athletes that you need to be aware of. Obviously, understanding kind of physical development and when that occurs and what some of the things that may occur with that development are just going to make you a better coach. They're going to make you understand your athlete better. Things like bone development, obviously, as someone goes through a large growth change, their bones are going to be in a kind of a fragile situation and something that you need to be aware of. So some of the activities that you may have them do, um, severe weight training, for example, added weight, when their bones aren't ready for that, may cause kind of long-term damage. But more of an immediate issue is that understanding kind of growth pains. I know I've seen some coaches that um, believe maybe that their players are complaining just because they don't want to work very hard, but yet some of the pain they may be going through may be the result of some of the growth plate changes. And I know many of you have probably gone through those changes yourself. So really the takeaway here is just to have try to have a good understanding of some of the physical changes that are going to happen to your athletes and when those changes might occur, and how to kind of be ready for them and recognize how your coaching may change because of it. So on top of that, we obviously have a very important period of time of development throughout adolescence, especially late childhood and into adolescence, where we have some emotional and cognitive development that may change the way that we approach our players. So, basically your approach to coaching your children may change year to year and may need to change year to year. Now, I'm not saying your philosophy needs to change, or even your objectives, but certainly your style and or your behaviors may need to change as a result of that. So things such as the development of different cognitive ability and understanding, that obviously is going to change. If you're dealing with 10-year-olds as opposed to 16-year-olds, there's going to be a difference there in terms of what they can understand from you. Um, but there's also going to be potentially a major difference in terms of competence, someone's ability, a belief in themselves, someone's belief in what they can do, so confidence and competence, um, and recognizing where those things might come from and what part you play as a coach in that development. Um, because obviously I would assume, I hope, that as a coach that you're going to want your players to be motivated to be able to continue participating in your sport or activity. For me as a coach, I always, one of the worst things that can happen, in my opinion, is someone not wanting to be part of your team or your program anymore for reasons outside of just, losing their love. You um, hate for someone to quit your team because they don't like you or they don't like the way that you handle things. Um, Now, in an ideal world, you get to choose the people that are on your team and that you get to work with, but that isn't always the case, and especially in many of the ages that you're going to deal with. So what's important is that you understand, how do I work within that person's emotional development, cognitive development, to try to make sure that they're motivated, and then if they're not going to be part of the team, that it's something that was for the best as opposed to something that you could have handled differently. So your objectives may be the same, but certainly your approach to them may need to be different. The way that you construct your practices, in terms of amount of time, in terms of the activities within practice, the amount of feedback that you give, and the type of feedback you give. And we certainly talked about this in terms of motivation, and how your objective may need to be trying to get that person a greater sense of competence, so therefore they're more motivated to continue to do that task. And then even in expectations, knowing what you can and should not expect in certain situations from your athletes, and having maybe expectations that are beyond what they're capable of doing at that point in time. Um, Adolescence, I think, is probably one of the most challenging periods to work with. One of the reasons I spoke about that in physical changes, but also in emotional changes, because as you'll see, just the research has shown that things change in terms of their where they come up with their own sense of self and what's important to them at those given times. Now, of course, these are just what data is showing us. That doesn't mean that individual athletes are going to be exactly like this, but generally we see that with early adolescents, which are going to be kind of that 11 to 14, kind of at the very front end of puberty. They're at that point, they're trying to kind of determine who they are. Sport can be a big part of that. And it can be a point in time where they decide that they are not who they thought they would be in terms of that sport. So you may have a large dropout rate. They have a great dependence on peers at that point in time, and you need to recognize that because that may change the way that you structure your practices, structure your culture on your team to try to determine ways in which those peers can be beneficial to their motivation, as opposed to them wanting to drop out of your sport or not give a lot of effort. In middle adolescence, kind of the 15 to 17 range, peers are obviously extremely important at this point, probably even more than they were in early adolescence. But then what's key here is that kind of emotionally they begin to move away from a self-centered view of the world. And certainly, childhood up through the beginning of adolescence, kids tend to think the world revolves around them, not necessarily in an ego way, but more in this is what they really care about, and they kind of have yet to develop an understanding of things outside of themselves. So that begins to happen here. So you can hopefully use that to your advantage as a coach to be able to not only with performance, but also in terms of their development, you helping them develop as people and recognizing some of their actions and how that's going to change. Late adolescence, which many of you have just gone through, or maybe even potentially still going through. And this is where you're becoming more independent. Obviously, that independence is in all aspects of your life, but then also in sport, you're starting to make more choices about your activities. You're choosing whether to continue to play in college, and whether that sport is important to you, what you're going to do with your life. So the key to know here is that when you work with these athletes, there are other things in their life that they're starting to become aware of, and that you may not have them as centered around your sport and your activity as you'd like them to be, but you also may have them truly committed to that and committed it for the right reasons, as opposed to mom and dad wanting them to do. So how do we practically use this information and what we know about emotional development? So I think kind of recognizing the importance of peers in a player's life, and kind of you understanding your players a little bit more and recognizing kind of what their peer groups might be, where their motivations may be pulled, so that either you can counteract that if you're trying to kind of keep them motivated in what you're doing, or you can recognize that and use it to your advantage to try to get them to develop a little bit more commitment in your area. The way you create practices, drills, activities, realizing what happens when you were to single someone out within a drill or activity, and how that may end up being problematic, given that what's really important to them is their acceptance by their peers. And so that participation and dropout rate is going to be based a lot of times on a person feeling competent and whether or not they believe their peers appreciate what they're doing. So let's kind of switch gears just a little bit, and we're not going to go too much in depth on this because there's so much we could get into. But cultural differences, the way that our society is changing, and there is kind of a greater inclusion of lots of diverse cultures within our environments that we have the opportunity really to kind of explore and expand our understanding of kind of cultural differences. So culture, the definition here, the social forces that shape our thoughts, ideas, and ways of interacting with the world. And so where is it that someone came from? What is it that they believe? What is it that they have been taught? Where are they, what has their upbringing been? And the more you understand that, the more you understand your athletes and where they came from, the better you're going to be at understanding how they may interpret your actions and your behaviors and your feedback and your expectations of them. Because as a coach, what you really want is you want, them kind of understanding what you are trying to get across. And if they buy into that, you often hear that term buy-in. If they buy into it, then you've got a better opportunity for success, okay, both as their development and the team success. So the big key, learn about the cultures that are represented on your team, learn about the cultures that are represented on opposing teams, and just kind of understand more about your athletes and where they're coming from, and how then your coaching can hopefully expand and become more effective. Now, obviously, the easiest coaching scenario would be if all of your players believed exactly what you did and came from the exact same place and the exact same situation that you did. So I said easiest doesn't necessarily mean it's the most enjoyable. I mean, I think personally the most enjoyable is when you can bring lots of backgrounds together and make them respect each other, and or have them develop respect for each other, so that they're all moving toward the same goal. To me, that's the most fun, but it's not always the easiest, because you have to potentially change the way that you coach, change the way that you behave, change the way that you interact with them. Comments that you may make to one player on your team may be seen as funny and kind of lighthearted, whereas to someone else may be seen as insulting, and potentially something that demotivates them. So kind of be aware of how some of those differences might be there. Obviously, you've heard the term of stereotypes and prejudices, and this is the challenge within this, is because that awareness that I'm hoping that you'll have and promoting for you to have, part of that awareness sometimes comes with stereotypes and prejudices. Now, to me, stereotypes are bad if they change your behavior. Okay, they may be good if you understand why they're there and can kind of work within that environment to either limit them or kind of learn more about them. So if you think about a stereotype or prejudice, kind of if they lead to expectations that you have of somebody, oh, that person is going to be more athletic than that person, or that person's going to be smarter than that person. When you start having those stereotypes simply based on the gender or the color of the skin or their ethnicity, that's when the problems can happen, right? Because you're now potentially changing your behaviors, which may then continue that stereotype. However, if you can recognize some of those stereotypes and kind of do your best to understand how some of the players may come with their own stereotypes, certainly don't want to kind of do reverse prejudice here and try to kind of swing the pendulum the other way, causing more stereotypes. But you certainly want to be aware of what's happening there. And I think it makes you a better coach, to understand kind of where these players are coming from and not necessarily expect a particular behavior from them, or attitude from them based on that culture, but recognizing that could be there and that their interpretation of what you're doing may be different. Okay, so the recognition of that, I think, makes you more aware and better, okay, and better in your job. All right, so let's pause and go to the third video.